All right, cool. So we'll just jump in. Just kind of checking in. We're starting our review of course 4. So over half the course or under our belts this week. I'm assuming you're both caught up.
So I used to be, and then we've been working. I'll send you guys a link later. We've been working on a nonprofit called Masks for Shy.
Okay.
We've already ordered 25,000 masks. We got funding for that from
wow.
businesses here, and we've already ordered 25,000 cloth reusable masks. Our goal was to order 350,000. So
okay.
The last week was spent building a website, staying up nonprofit, doing the order, and so everything else is falling apart for me except building a nonprofit right now.
Wow.
Hey, Jose, have you seen the video by Destin from Smarter Every Day on what they did to put together face shields and how they integrated locally with their community?
I have not, but I'm Googling it now. Smarter Every Day.
Smarter Every Day. It's a fantastic video about how he says, a lot of times, engineering people, we're all fixated on making the thing. But he talks all about the infrastructure needed to deliver stuff into the community to make sure it gets to the right people and make sure we're getting the right things to the right people. So it's fantastic.
All right. Is it Destin, like Destin?
I think so, yeah.
This one here?
Yep, that's the one.
Huh.
Yeah. One of the things he does, he sort of chastises the engineer type is like, so, we tend to go, well, it could be better if we did this. He says, don't be that guy.
Uh-huh.
Do what needs to be done, even if there's a better way of doing it. Just, join in with what's happening. So anyway, it's a really good video on not just the making side of it, but how to try to, actually close the loop, the last mile, so to speak.
Wait, is this a 10-hour-long video?
No. Well, that's only 10 minutes. Should be only 10 minutes. Well, let me go find it.
Oh,
I'll go find it.
Okay.
Got it. Oh, that's awesome, Tracy. Thank you. Yeah, look, we borrowed a lot actually from Jacksonville. There's an organization there called Masks for Jacks. We borrowed a lot of the website design, a lot of the initial structure from them, and we're just trying to ramp up as quickly as possible.
Perfect. That's exactly the type of thing he's advocating.
The website is masks for MASKS forshy.org. But give it a second because I actually on this call pushed an update to it, and I think it's taken a little bit. So
Okay.
I'll remind you guys at the end. To give it a sec. I just pushed an update because there it is. It's running now. If you go to masksforshy.org, MASKS forshy.org.
SKS 4, number 4?
CHI.org. And then the features that will go live later this afternoon because they were built last night and this morning is actually donation and a bunch of other links to some of our partners that are helping us. But did it load up on your end?
Looks like it just loaded up.
So that's what we've been working on. So sorry, I am behind in class, but but this is where
a good reason to be.
Yeah. So the goal is to get 350,000 masks here in the next couple of weeks, and then it's to raise awareness. We don't want people going outside, obviously, right?
Yeah.
To wear a mask. There's a bunch of resources there that show that it it's shown to significantly flatten the curve very quickly.
Yep.
Cloth masks. This initially started because my wife was actually sewing cloth masks, and then
Oh, really?
the idea came to actually do it this way, and now we found a supplier out of Vietnam that can get us. Yeah, the masks are 75 cents each, so
Okay.
it was to get 350,000 at that price and get them here as quickly as possible.
Oh, wow. What is how long do you think it'll take to get them once you order them?
So the first order, 25,000, should be here by late next week. It might be here by Wednesday, but it should be here by Friday.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea is we're going to distribute them in two ways. One is to raise awareness, like restaurants that do carry out or delivery. We're going to partner with some of them, just put 2 masks in each of their carry out and delivery orders so people just get them at home.
Huh.
The other one is obviously there's a lot of very vulnerable communities in Chicago, like the Roseland community is being particularly hit hard. If you go to chicagotribune.com today, you'll see an article on them.
Okay.
So to work with food pantries and other maybe clinics, other locations where people have to go, so that we mask that way. We obviously don't want to encourage people to go anywhere they don't have to go.
Yeah.
But we're going to distribute them that way.
That's awesome.
So thanks.
I wonder if anyone's doing that here.
Say that again.
I was wondering if anyone is doing that here in St. Louis.
So as I say, if you know anyone that wants to do this in St. Louis or in Oregon or wherever, just send me an email or send me a chat via Slack. Like I said, we borrowed a lot of the design and logos from the Mass for Jacks team. They were helpful in that. And the same now we've built the website. I've been leading that charge. So like if someone in St. Louis or Oregon wants to do it, I will hand over all the templates and everything to them, and it should be pretty good. So hopefully we can actually build a network of cities doing this or states. That'd be great.
Cool.
And I just posted the link to that video in the Slack channel.
All right.
Thanks, Tracy. Although I don't see it. Did you post it to everyone? We might have done it individually.
I put it on the AI Enterprise Workflow and then added you and Sam.
Oh, okay. On the Slack. Awesome. Perfect. I was looking at the.
Got it. Okay.
Sorry, not this channel. Yeah, I should have put it in the chat channel here. I wasn't, just forget about that.
No, that's fine.
I see it there.
Hey, Jess.
Oh, too. How are you? Yeah, Jess.
Hello. I don't know why in Zoom, but sometimes the space bar works to unmute you and sometimes it doesn't. So,
I didn't know that ever worked.
60% of the time it does.
That's helpful.
Yeah, the other 40% of the time I'm just talking and nobody is hearing me.
How are you making out?
I'm hanging in there. Actually, my spouse and I did get the virus and have been, struggling through recovering from that. And it's surreal, because we've been going through this and yet really surrounded in this area with lots of folks who just not only don't take it seriously, but now like in the past week or two have started to protest things like wearing masks and business closures and whatnot. So it's very surreal.
Just think of it as evolution.
Kind of do, but I don't like to say that, like sometimes I don't know if you've following, the news or what, and I don't want to go too far into it, but there are some certain groups that are forming these large protests. And I saw a picture of them actually on I think they must have been some much larger city that has like a train or something. And they were all packed in there, to go to this protest. And I thought, well, is it so bad?
Natural selection in process.
Exactly.
I saw that, like pictures of some of those cities, and then Trump coming out, kind of going against the state governments.
Yeah,
it's a shit show.
It really kind of is, and and so it's just like, I not in a mean way, but just like in a you have to laugh or you might cry kind of way. Okay, if you want to go to a large, close together protest, then maybe that's just, nature unfolding. I don't know. Not sure what to say to that, but it's surreal, to kind of have that personal experience and to be kind of self-quarantine in our home and like not even going out much, and then just like these images and things that we're seeing from the outside world, so to speak. It's just
the problem with that, though, unfortunately, is the models show that I don't know the exact number, and it can't be exact because these models, it turns out, are fairly chaotic. But if you drop like below 20% or drop below 80% compliance with what are called non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, so social distancing and stuff, those are called NPIs, you drop below about 80% compliance, it's almost as if you didn't do it at all. So those protesters can actually have the possibility of eradicating it. It's like the, you know, this, I think it was wasn't it South Korea? Where they've traced it back, although it's hard to trace because the church is being very secretive about it, but they think they've traced it back to one person who attended the mega church, and out of that mega church, eventually half of South Korea got exposed because, you know, that's how this virus works. So don't quote me on those numbers, but the concept is definitely there. So yeah, those protesters, it's not just, oh, well, let them all get the virus, unfortunately. They will turn right around and respread it through the community.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's also really unclear, like there's a lot of either just outright misinformation health-wise, or just things that we don't know yet, you know, and that people are presenting possibilities as though they're true facts, right? So one of those is, I mean, one of those is like the immunity, right? Like, so it's actually quite unclear right now whether the virus gets reactivated within a certain individual, or there was just like an incorrect diagnosis initially, or what's happening there. But I think it was something like only 2% are really demonstrating now from the testing to have immunity if they had COVID-19. That's not a lot. So if that's the case, but it's just unclear. But there's like a lot that's being put out in the public eye that if you have it, then you've developed immunity. And even like New York Times articles like, oh, since you had it, you now have immunity and you now can be at the store and run errands for your family and, you know, just move freely. And like, let's have cards that, you know, like I have my immunity card, which doesn't even really necessarily medically mean I really am immune. I mean, it's just very scary, the things that are spinning out from what is like maybe not even accurate information.
Yeah. We have Ibrahim joined. Hey, Ibrahim. If you're speaking, you're on mute. If you're not, that's fine.
Hello, Sarah.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. We were just starting to talk about where everyone was in the course, and that, like most other conversation starters, I think ended up having us talk about Corona and COVID. Are you just getting started with the specialization?
No, I started with earlier, so I'm catch up already.
Okay, cool. All right, well, let's jump in. Again, we're starting course 4, week 1. Jess, how about you? Where are you with regard to the course?
So I haven't started the course 4 yet.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I think the end result of the catch-up week was probably not. I don't know that was the right strategy. I think I know for myself, I did not catch up or get ahead rather during the catch-up time, and we didn't have a lot of takers of new folks wanting to come in. So probably wasn't well, it was an experiment that you know, probably did not yield a lot of benefit, but so it was. But we are here talking about this first part of course 4, with the objectives being to discuss different metrics for regression classification and multi-label classification. Describe common strategies for doing grid search and cross-validation. Being able to explain the use of linear models in supervised learning. There's a test, there's a little module on Watson natural language understanding. And then the case study really focuses on kind of building pipelines around evaluation metrics and thinking about how to select them for use in production. And there's this broader theme that runs through the kind of the narrative of the week. It isn't fully fleshed out, but it's the idea of connecting your evaluation metrics to your ultimate business metric. Just FYI here, I did not go through the Watson NLU this time. We're talking about, we do talk about natural language stuff in the case study, but not the Watson stuff per se. But I will have a kind of run through of that for next time. So the first part of the, I guess before I start kind of meta commentary on this module, there is a ton of background stuff that you can dig into for this module. A lot of the stuff is stuff that you've probably come across at least at a high level previously, but there are, you know, as has typically been the case with this course, you know, tons of links to like Wikipedia pages and sklearn docs and, you know, other opportunities to dig into kind of great detail with some of the things that are discussed. And I've got some other resources that I'll point you to in here for a couple of things that I wanted to dig into a little bit deeper. But we start out with a discussion around regression metrics. The two main ones are ones that you'll likely be familiar with, root mean square error and mean absolute error. And a lot of the focus is really on kind of understanding how they compare and contrast. If you do the practice question, the quiz / practice question grading in this module is particularly wonky. So there's a practice question that is something along the lines of, you know, why might you choose root mean square error over mean absolute error, or vice versa? And the, you know, the answers are, you know, things that kind of touch on these differences and similarities between the two. Hold on, let me quiet down this Slack. I am, by the way, I just closed Slack, so if anyone wants to ping me from this group, do it in the Zoom chat. So going back to kind of comparing and contrasting, so both of these units, or both of these metrics use the same units as the data itself, so you don't have to worry about that in comparing these two. The main difference is that root mean square error, because you're squaring your residual, it penalizes large errors a lot more than mean absolute error. And this, these tables here provide a good illustration of that. So if you've got evenly distributed errors, your mean absolute error and root mean square error, you know, would be the same. If you've got a small variance in errors, your root mean square error is a little bit bigger. But if you've got you know, a large outlier, it really increases your root mean square error. And so that's something that you want to think about when you're choosing a regression metric. You'll often find root mean square error used in used as a loss function in machine learning, primarily because it's differentiable. The square is continuous, whereas the absolute value isn't differentiable, or isn't differentiable over the entire range. let me catch up on the chat here. Any questions on this?
Has anybody, this seems like a pretty obvious and quick and dirty way of sort of even testing for outliers. Is that common practice? Calculate both and go, hey, look, there's a difference. There must be outliers.
That is interesting. I've not considered or seen that. I think there are other things that will cause your root mean square error to grow if you've got kind of lots of changes in variance that aren't necessarily huge, that can cause your root mean square error to grow. So I don't know that it's considered a particularly strong practice to do that, but it could be a quick and dirty test. And it may be something that is done commonly. I've not seen it though. I thought I had a link to let's see, this article is where I got the oops, put this in the chat, is where these tables came from. And they talk about the this concept of root mean square error increasing with the variance of the frequency distribution of the error, which will give you a little bit more insight into why that might not work. It's a pretty good article. All right, so next we talk about classifier metrics. This was a chart that we looked at in course 3, and we spent a lot of time in this particular module looking at F1 or F beta score in more detail. F beta score is kind of the generalization of F1 or the generalized metric, from which F1 arises. F1, you'll recall, is the harmonic mean of precision and recall, and that can be generalized in this F beta formula, where beta here is essentially a multiplier on the importance of recall. So if you want to emphasize recall, you use a beta that is greater than 1. And if you want to de-emphasize recall relative to precision, you would use a beta of less than 1. So you'd have, for example, F2 versus a F.5 would emphasize and de-emphasize recall respectively. And I threw up this reference to a podcast that I did with Sami Cuello. He is an academic that has looked at a couple of things around metrics. In particular, some of this discussion touches on research that he does that allows you to or shows how you can create kind of arbitrary linear combinations of any of the kind of relationships in a multi-class confusion matrix and use those as your optimization metric. Interesting discussion. So next, any question on the classifier metrics? For both the regression and the classification metrics, thought I closed that. for both the regression and classification metrics, the course points out and lists a ton of different metrics, but the emphasis is on the kind of the most common ones, and the others are kind of presented as you know, extra credit background research, but I'm not discussing any of the less common ones here. So next up, we talk about model validation and K-fold validation in particular, and a couple of different flavors of K-fold validation. One being shuffle and split, which is just what it sounds like. You are shuffling your data set before the split each time, and the other is stratified K-fold validation. We looked at stratified K-fold in, I think it was course 3, where we were looking at class imbalances. So what stratified does is it tries to make sure that the classes are balanced across the different folds. We also talk about parameter tuning. They mention both grid and random. Grid has been what we've used most in the different case study problems, and random search is a way to try to speed up the process by instead of exhaustively searching the hyperparameter space, selectively, but via random searching different hyperparameter combinations. Another podcast reference, this is an interview with Scott Clark, who is the founder of a software company called SIGOPT that focuses on Bayesian optimization for hyperparameter tuning that in many cases will be both a lot faster than grid or random search, but also more systematic than random.
Just going to chip in here that if, I don't know how many of you guys have played with this, but it was really eye-opening for me the first time I actually demonstrated the random search and how when you marginalize the parameters, you know, you get a much smoother function. So that's, it's a pretty cool, simple extension to your grid search.
Can you, what was your setup for testing it?
Yeah, so let's say you have, two parameters. So let's say I want to test 4 values of those 2 parameters. If you, so I would have 16 spots in my grid, right? So 4 by 4. But if I marginalize, I only have 4 data points on each one of those things. Whereas if I randomize, if I randomly drop 16 into that space, then I get 16 points across both dimensions. And so it creates a smoother function as I'm looking at how each particular parameter is behaving.
Cool. So next, they talked about bias variance. This is another one that is, at least at the surface level, is probably very familiar. This is talked about in most kind of beginning or intro to machine learning courses. Bias being kind of related to the accuracy of your model, its ability to kind of predict on target, and variance relating to the kind of the spread of the predictions. The typical or the usual relationship or is usually related to the idea of overfitting and underfitting, where if you've got a model with a lot of with a lot of, with very low bias rather, you may have overfit your model. And this is a good reference here. This bias variance, that's this one, and then the emphasis in the discussion in the lecture is really focused on some of the things you can do when you're dealing with high bias or high variance. So there's a relationship between bias and variance and your model. So again, if you've got a very complex model, you might exhibit having very low bias and high variance, so performing very well on your training set and poorly on your test set. And so one of the things you can do to remediate that is to decrease the complexity of your model. If you've got high bias, you can add more features and increase the complexity of your model. If you've got high variance, you can decrease the complexity of your model. Likewise, in the high bias scenario, you can add regularization to try to, or decrease regularization with high bias, and add regularization with high variance to try to find a good balance of the two. And this article does a good job of talking about, what you're looking for is kind of the point in which your model kind of unit increases in bias result in decreases in variance and vice versa. That's kind of an equilibrium point that you're kind of looking for in your experimentation. Any thoughts or questions on this one? So then the next section of the lectures kind of go through linear models. So they talk about general linear models, so things like linear regression and ANOVA and some other things that we've discussed in previous modules. And then they relate general linear models to generalized linear models, such as logistic regression. They introduced the idea of generalized linear mixed models, but they don't really go into a lot of detail. They essentially present a lot of links to the scikit-learn docs for each of these, but without a whole lot of discussion outside of the idea of lasso and ridge as regularizers. And it didn't. None of that conversation comes up in the in the case study as well. So that's kind of presented for context and for you to dig into on your own. So that's mostly the material that is discussed in the course. Then before we jump into the case study, any questions or thoughts or discussion points or experience shares related to the material that's discussed? I kind of found this to be a weird unit in that at the surface level, it's all kind of familiar stuff, but then, you know, there's a lot of links to details to models that, you know, some of which I haven't, you know, looked at all. And I did not have time to dig into all of that detail. There's just a ton of detail there if you want to go through it all.
That was my same sense as well. It was weird. It was sort of introduced as a basic level, but then they drilled down into all those things that I've never had a chance to really drill into. I thought it was interesting to separate the general versus generalized linear models. Hadn't really seen that so much.
Yeah, same here. And I was hoping that they would kind of make that more concrete through the case study, but the case study, as we'll see, kind of returns to the TF-IDF stuff that we were doing in course 3. I think this may be, depending on how detailed the second week is, you know, if there's an area that I want to dig into deeper, it's the mixture models and how those work. So for the case study, I am most of the way through that. I found that my, as you'll see, code for course 3, week 2 came in handy here. So so we did a kind of an informal TWIML community happy hour yesterday afternoon for folks on the West Coast. It was very small. There are about half a dozen of us. But one of the things that I learned that I had not come across before that was super helpful is I always found that completion in Jupyter notebooks is really slow. But this magic incantation right here, essentially turning off Jedi, I guess, for completions, makes it so much faster. So someone shared that in the discussion yesterday, and I found it super useful already. So basically, the scenario here is that, you know, again, you're kind of a data scientist at Avail. Avail is going to be introducing comments or has enabled users to comment on the streaming service, and ultimately you want to be able to apply a classifier to those comments to predict customers' likelihood to churn. We don't have this data yet, so we're going to build a pipeline on some other data that is similar, and you know, with the hopes that that will give us a head start when we come to working with our actual data. So the data set that we're going to use is the same movie review database that we used in course 3. That is, where did that go? Oh, we downloaded it, I guess. Oh yeah, so sorry, you downloaded it previously, and you're loading it here. I was looking for it as a import from sklearn or something. So you're loading your data, and you are starting by printing out some summary statistics and some simple visualizations. If you look at the data set, it consists of 2,000 reviews. Positive and negative labeled reviews are, you know, are balanced 50-50. the average review length is almost 4,000 characters or 750 words. The median words or tokens per review is about 700. There are about 50,000 unique tokens in the entire data set. So this is kind of the visualization. Then the next question is, or the next part is to build out a lematizer and a process for processing your corpus. Again, this is the same one that we used in, or I used the same one that we used in course 3.
Sam?
Yep.
So a quick question. So in your stop list up there, right?
Yeah.
No, yeah, you're picking out like and good. And again, I'm still on question 3. I haven't made it, 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever yet. But does that, is that going to skew your attempts to understand the meaning of the movies by removing those?
Yeah, that would probably not be a good thing to leave in from a predicting sentiment perspective. Those came from in course 3, week 1, what we're doing was clustering. And you'd have these kind of fairly generic terms that didn't help you understand what the clusters might be. So I just dropped those out. And so you're absolutely right. Like to, continuing to build a classifier, you would want to get rid of those terms, although the performance of the model that I saw was not any different than the one that they got in the answers. So the training process seemed to be pretty robust to removing those particular couple of words. A couple of other things that I did that they did not do in the solution is I noticed that this time that there were a lot of numeric tokens, and I just got rid of those. And I also got rid of the pronoun that results from the lemmatization process that I did last time as well. And I also, I found that if you don't kind of decode the Unicode before you lemmatize, you end up with all these words that have B's at the beginning, like B Arnold and BI and bit when it was really it. So I have this pre-processing step here. And then you're basically, the next step is, this is also basically what we did in course 3, week 1, is process your corpus. And then you summarize your corpus and kind of see what's different. The average review length is a lot smaller and the average number of tokens is a lot smaller. I think that's because before the processing, a lot of your like your punctuation will end up being tokens. And so you get rid of a lot of that kind of thing. But the distribution looks roughly similar in shape, so that's a good thing. And then, so question 4, you're now starting to build a pipeline to train the classifier. So you're doing your kind of standard train test split, printing some stats around your, just kind of checking here. And then the first classifier that we use is this complement NB. That's one of the naive Bayes classifiers. And you build out a pipeline like we've done with other examples where you kind of specify the steps in your pipeline. Here I built a function to run the pipeline that is parameterized by the classifier and the grid search parameters. And so the rest of this is standard. Give it some grid search parameters and then run your pipeline, and you get pretty much kind of consistent, class consistent F1 scores of 0.8 here. And then you are asked to try to beat the base model. Well, before I go on, any questions on this first run? I basically chose this complement ND because that's what they did in the solution. I didn't try any of the others here. Also, the other hint is if you look at which of the, actually that wasn't the case here. I was going to say sometimes you can tell what they want you to use by looking at what they've already imported for you. But here you do it on your own. But yeah, I'm describing cheating techniques. The next step was to try to use the SGD classifier. I've got an error in here that I have not been able to find. It doesn't like something about the my keyword here, penalty. I don't know what the problem is, but we can switch over to the solution. They did not kind of parameterize everything, so this is their complement, and here they're doing SGD. When I did SGD without doing a grid search on the penalty, it did not perform as well. So it was like 0.71, 0.77, that kind of thing for F1 score. So I am trying to add the penalty here as they did in the solution to try to get an uplift in performance, but that's where I currently am. These questions are out of order. So then that's about as far as I got with this one. The next steps here are, so we've got a classifier. We want to see, we got a classifier as a function that will simulate the results, enter the accuracy value, which you get from the classification report. So this they give us, and then then they want you to, let's see what this classification report. Oops. So we're getting a classification report, and then they want us to use the simulate production function, and then the rest of this code is visualization. Again, I have not gone through this part yet, but we can talk about this at the beginning of next time. As well as the comments here. Any questions on, at least, of how far I got in the case study?
So I guess my question is, I haven't gotten, to questions 4 and 5 yet, but just kind of looking at what you've done and looking back at supposedly the emphasis of this module, which was, okay, you need to present all of your wonderful numbers in business language.
Mhm.
And it just feels a little bit to me like they abandoned that in this assignment, that there should have been more emphasis on how are you going to translate this into the business metrics. Am I just missing it because I haven't gotten through there yet, or is that kind of
I
your
think
impression as well?
I think that that is where we're trying to get in question 4. So um, we can dig into this simulate production function here. So takes a value for test model accuracy and returns a data frame with relevant. I'm not sure what that means. So test accuracy. Okay, so we are parameterizing our accuracy. We're getting some random data. Projected EM. Projected VM. Yeah, I would have, I'm drawing a blank on EM and BM for some reason. Is it obvious to any of you what that means? Oh, evaluation metric and business metric, duh, okay. So, yeah, I think what I would have to play with this more than I have, but I think what we're doing here is trying to get at this question, Tracy, where we're looking at the churn, which is this red curve, and the accuracy, and it's not clear to me that we've been successful in relating our accuracy to our churn, which, sometimes they kind of do that in this course. For better or for worse, they say, here's this technique we talked about. Let's try it and see if it worked. Oh, well, it didn't work this time. Where, sometimes I feel like a positive example of it working would be more instructive. But we can see that version 1 of the website seems to increase. Oh, so these are different versions. Version 1 of the website seems to increase churn. Version 2 decrease churn. Yeah, I need to play with this a little bit more, but I think that's what they're trying to do here. But I agree, it doesn't seem like, it seems like there's a piece that is pulling it together that is not obvious to me just yet.
So one of the things that, I don't know if this would fit into this, this time, like maybe next week, is hearing from the diverse set of experiences of everyone else in the group, because I tend to look at these things more from a research or engineering perspective. So this whole think about it from the business perspective is stretching, and it's the type of stretching I kind of am in the class for. So I would love to hear other people's takes or experiences with how they have taken some metric like churn and tied it, in their case, like to success of release 1 versus release 2 of the website, or some other metric from your world that you've been able to say, and I've tied it into a business objective over here in this way. So I work best with examples, And I would really love to hear, from other people what, how they've taken the concepts in this particular module and maybe done them in the real world.
Anyone want to comment on that? Or have anything to share?
This is just to kind of seed some discussion. This is especially relevant because one of the tasks that I have at work is Oregon is doing this experiment called War and Melanoma. It's based on an experiment done in Germany, the Schleswig-Holstein experiment. And what we're trying to do is create awareness and educational opportunities for people to be able to look at their skin and discover suspicious lesions. There's some hypotheses behind it, but so one of the things I have stepped in to do is take all this effort that they have done and start saying, wait a second, have these, look at the Google Analytics, have these campaigns yielded what we're looking for? So trying to go in and tie in things like when our dermatologists go do trainings around the state, or when we do a promotional campaign on billboards versus Facebook or things like that, to how to begin thinking about those in terms of the actual objectives of the project. So that's my immediate application of this particular technique. And again, when I listen to other people do it in their world, it helps me figure out how to build those bridges in my world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will for next week see if I can find someone who can maybe jump on and spend a few minutes talking about that, to provide some additional kind of examples and illustrations. Jess, have you run across that?
In terms of what specifically are we looking for?
Yeah, I think the question is like the suggestion in the course in this particular course 4 is that at least the way I'm interpreting it is that in your pipeline, like you should be trying to build kind of hard correlations, I guess, or you should be trying to get as close to your business metric as you can, almost in your pipeline, as opposed to using your, the kinds of metrics that we're talking about here. So you should be, building out, in your pipeline, kind of correlations between what you actually care about, which is churn, and
Right.
you're tracking, as you're training your models, which is accuracy. And I think the question is like, how do you do that? And, what are some examples of, how folks have gone about that? But I think it's not uncommon for, those to be separate, where, you believe that, the accuracy of your model and your ability to predict churn are correlated, and you predict churn, you predict, you are predicting, you're predicting churn, and you're kind of tracking the accuracy of your models, and you believe that as your model gets better, you should be able to predict churn better, and that has some kind of downstream benefit for you, and you can probably kind of come up with a relationship from a the relationship, I think, depends on what you ultimately do with the churn data. Like if you are presenting offers to the customers that are about to churn to try to get them on board, then that is going to relate to, then you've got another, model that you have to think about. But I think the general idea is that you want to try to think about these problems end to end. But I'm not even really clear. I need to go back through and get a sense more concretely if they're suggesting that.
So I kind of think what they're suggesting is the premise of that book. I think you actually turned us on to somehow I got turned on to this a few weeks back. Sorry, the Storytelling with Data book by Cole, whatever her last name is.
Mm-hmm.
And she has like one of the best examples in the whole book. She shows a plot that she's very carefully pruned all the extraneous stuff away from to take numbers of delay in response to customer requests and ties that into some people that quit the group. And so she's able to turn this statistic about lag time into an action item. The business needs to replace those 2 people we lost back on this date. And you see it very clearly in the chart. Oh, we were tracking pretty closely. We had low lag times until we lost those people, and then the lag times increased. So that type of thing where you're taking a metric like how long does it take us to answer the phone, and you're tying that into what the business cares about. And so the grabbing all these metrics are things that we probably are all pretty good at. I can go on to Google Analytics and I can download, hits and all kinds of reports that they have. But how do I take that and think about that in terms of actually what are we trying to accomplish as an organization or as a business? And the way I learn best is when I've got lots and lots and lots of examples. It's like, how do you learn to do statistics? You don't go read the formula for something. You go do 100 problems, and then you go like, oh, I think I figured out how to calculate a mean now. And so that's what I think I'm asking for. I'm thinking people in this group, as you think about it, maybe even over the week, and if I can dare to propose this, maybe next week, take a few minutes and say, yeah, I did think about that this week, and here are some examples in my world where I've taken this raw number and turned it into a meaningful number, as it were.
So Tracy, I think it's a really good question. I think certainly thinking about examples. My background is a little bit more on the business side. Like I have an MBA and spent more time doing management work than I have done machine learning work. And I guess the way at least the teams I've been on, we've always thought about it as what are the priority business or organizational questions? So in this case, right, you want to, whatever situation we want to minimize churn, or you want to gain new customers, or you want to answer the question on what methods and techniques or communications are most effective in decreasing the incidence of melanoma, whatever it is. Like have that business question, and then dig into the data, and probably have hypotheses on what are the metrics that matter to drive that result, and then dig into the data and find those metrics and discover whether you're right or wrong, right? Whether you can disprove that hypothesis or not. And then in doing that, you identify the metrics that really matter, and then bring that back to the business owner to say, hey, it's this that matters. It turns out if we do XYZ, people behave this way. Or if we do ABC and you add more people to this team and remove these people from this team, you will be more effective. That's the way I've always thought about it from a business perspective. I don't know, do you find that answer helpful, or can I clarify more?
I guess
that fits in with my.
I guess
Go
I
ahead, Jess.
find that a lot of these things like kind of have a missing link, which is okay. So even if we can accurately predict churn, we know if this person is going to churn or not, let's say, what can we do about it? why are they doing, right? So there's almost like this sort of behavioral design piece that's often lacking, right? And it's almost as though like the point of using these tools is to answer those questions. But I think one of the criticisms in how it's done, you know, sort of in the practical day to day and some of those statistics, why data science projects fail and, you know, that kind of thing, is coming from that gap between, okay, we can predict these things, but what do we do about these things? And really, who should that be coming from? Is that going to come from the business side, or is there something in the data science, machine learning side that is supposed to be answering that, like through, you know, some causality analysis or things like looking at, you know, what features are driving this model, right? Like using Lime or other tools, like kind of where does that question get answered? Okay, we now can accurately predict this, and we can even to some degree, you know, kind of tell you what appear to be the major factors contributing to this, but then there's a piece where you have to do something about that. And so I think that's often kind of where the gap may happen.
So I think I agree that in my experience, at least some, you know, business leaders often, I've seen business leaders respond well when their data team or whoever, you know, that analytics team comes to them and says, this is the answer to the question we're looking at. Here's an option on what we can do about it, or 3 options. Usually it's better to do 1 though. Or here's the option we recommend. And then what are your thoughts? And that usually engages them, and then a discussion back and forth on, okay, why is that it? What's the reason? Tell me about the reason in the data and your modeling and what you did. But sort of always coming to that business leader with that push of this is what we think has always been far more effective. When I've seen someone come to them and say, you asked us to answer this question, here's all the data we analyzed and the results we got, without this is what it means for the business or for your organization. Often I've seen those data teams get ignored or passed over because the business person doesn't engage with this is the data or this is the analysis. They engage on this is what you need to do about it.
Yeah, I still think there's even a missing link in there, right? Like, so the really large successful tech companies, they do have behavioral economists and social scientists and behavioral scientists on their teams, and they don't get a lot of publicity about that. But so for example, let's say it's women are turning. Okay, what do we do about that? And so from kind of the model that you're describing, either a data scientist or the business person, the business leader, whatever that role would be, is going to decide what might influence the behavior of women. But actually, a behavioral economist, somebody who focuses on behavioral design, that's actually the person that's going to be able to give you that answer. They wouldn't know, however, that that's the question to be answered without the data science piece, you know, kind of showing what's going on with churn, right? And then that somebody focused on behavioral design can then maybe suggest a few things to do, results of which they'll work with the data science team to see if it was effective. And then of course, like the business or the product side kind of, you know, leading how they want to take that forward and how exactly it's going to roll out and what that would look like. I guess that's the way I'm seeing that it is maybe really working at some of the really high performing companies, but I feel like that's not clear because there's kind of like that missing link of like what the actual pipeline of roles is.
Yeah, I agree. In the ideal, that's definitely the structure you want, right? But smaller organizations often don't have that, so somehow you have to build that behavior.
Right.
Somehow, at least have someone that has a basic understanding of it, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of these kind of go south a bit, is because that link is missing. And so it's sort of like, you know, the data science machine learning team, you know, and the business team, they're, you know, it kind of swings back and forth, you know, like where is this going wrong, right? But I think often it's going wrong because there's that invisible sort of missing link between the data and what you want to do about that to meet your business metric or your business goals.
I think back in the context of the course, they talk a little bit about the this design thinking process and the I forget the term they use, but basically the readouts at the end of an iteration where you're engaging with your stakeholders and you're kind of talking about, what you've observed and getting their input and using that as input to refine the next iteration of the process, kind of captures, how you can fill those gaps, whether you've got some dedicated, specialist team that can do that, or whether it's through collaboration between the data science team and the stakeholders. At some point you're going to have to start to answer these questions about what does this data mean and how can we use it to affect the goals that we're trying to affect in the organization. And it's through collaboration of the available parties that it's going to eventually happen, or not.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many examples of this being like sort of the missing link for the impact that you're actually trying to have. So like in health, you can know what factors are going to be really negative if someone is diabetic, but getting them to engage in the behaviors that they need to do can be difficult, right? And then will totally impact, the outcome that you get for those patients. So if you try to skip it by just having medical expertise and no health behavior expertise, then I don't see how you really influence that kind of downstream. Or like masks for all, you can provide the masks, but if people won't wear them, that's your actual issue right there. And so at some point you have to look at the behavioral design and kind of get this piece figured out, and not just sort of the machine learning approach, which is like to just run every option and see what worked. It's sort of like, yeah, there can be some expertise first in this area. And so I think it's a little invisible and behind the scenes that some of those really high performance companies actually do have these professionals, and they work with other professionals and kind of ramp up their skill set in that as well. So that maybe over time the data scientists do sort of get an idea about some of the behavioral design pieces.
There's an interesting, to your point, even in the healthcare space, one of the ways that idea of, what you're talking about, Sam, about stakeholders, they've discovered that if you, as a doctor, go in and say, okay, I've run the, diagnostics and I've looked at your symptoms, you have this and you should do this. People are going to not be as compliant as if you go in and you say, here are some options. What do you think will work best for you? And when they have input, surprise, surprise, compliance levels go up. So that's a new trend in medicine, even though doctors are like, you've got 10 minutes to get in and get out.
Right.
It's like, but in that 10 minutes, you really got to bring them on board by letting them have input into the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting too, you guys are reiterating a lot of what's sort of being, popping up in the material. So like, again, going back to the storytelling with Databook, her biggest kind of push is don't plop up a slide that says, this is the data, plop up a slide that says, this is what we need to do. And then Jess, you're kind of talking about this whole diverse team idea from design thinking. The diverse team needs to have people who know how to how to help people with their behaviors. That's a good input.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't think, there's anything inherent to machine learning or data science training where folks are really getting that expertise per se. I mean, they're getting all kind of expertise in running models and working with data and telling you these are the results. But I don't see the missing link where they're connecting with experts in behavioral economics or behavioral design or any of those things that they would be qualified or necessarily super capable to take what they're seeing as a data scientist and then start suggesting these possibilities of what to do. I mean, opinions, everybody always has one. So you could look at it and you can make some guesses and make suggestions. I just don't know how well informed they are or the kind of the expertise level. And so I think sometimes those data science teams, then they view that as the business side's responsibility. But again, the business side may not really necessarily have that expertise either. And so that's why I call it kind of a missing link.
What's interesting in here for me in your comments is I think in a lot of the, materials like this course and others, and in just general parlance, we talk about kind of the data scientists, the importance of the data scientists working with the domain experts, as if there's just a uniform domain expert, right? And there's one person that the data scientist is going to work with that knows everything about the problem, where as you may have domain experts that you need to work with to really understand the data generation model and where the data comes from and what issues might be inherent in the data. You may have a totally different person that has expertise in remediation strategies and things you might want to test on the back end of the process.
Yeah, I mean, like, I find it a pretty interesting example that Cassie Korzakov at Google, who's, in charge of the data science and analytics, came from psychology. That's her background.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I found that really interesting to discover that really a lot of the, almost like, I don't know if this is true. I don't know enough about how the teams are structured, but it almost seems like that's the next level of, I don't know, career progression or professional development really for data science leaders, is gaining that sort of expertise, right? Like they've got the technical and they've got the mathematical and all this, but it's gaining that, like somehow bridging closer to understanding the behavior and how to move the needle and being able to work really well with the business side in order to do that.
Well, Jess, you would be really pleased that in the grant proposal that we put together last year, which we just learned got rejected, there were two parts to it. One part was we were developing, the quintessential holy grail classifier for looking at skin lesions and detecting which ones are suspicious. But the thing I insisted on in the grant was that we have the behavioral person who would help us design the right way of messaging that to users. Right. So let's say you had a phone and you clicked on it and you took a picture and it said, what's it going to say to you that's going to affect the right change? Because we have to walk a really thin line. Because if we say, oh, this is a suspicious melanoma or a suspicious lesion, you should go have it looked at, we're going to flood the healthcare system that's already overburdened, and we're going to do damage to the whole process that way. If we go the other direction and say, this is perfectly fine, and we kind of, do that for 2 or 3 melanomas that are not perfectly fine, then we've done the other wrong thing. So part of what we really needed to do was find the right kind of messaging that would sort of say, you don't need to go see a doctor right now because this isn't that suspicious, but you do need to monitor it. So we needed to drive behavior in the way that wasn't going to flood the healthcare system, wasn't going to tell people that it was okay when it wasn't okay. So that was a huge challenge.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and even if you had solved the question of impact on the healthcare system, then you still are left with the issue of what about the percentage of people who will show a result that they should go get checked out, but yet they don't. And there are ways to influence that, right? But they may not be obvious. And then you want to monitor those and see what's working and what isn't working.
So I agree. I've often thought about, because I think Tracy, a few weeks back, you had said something along the lines of there being a really big need for someone who performs this role of connecting data scientists with business owners, and how to communicate that. I don't know if any of you have any experience, because to me, I've always thought that there's almost like a big need for what would almost be a data science consulting startup that would do this specific role, because Google obviously has the resources, like you said, just to have this person in-house. And a lot of other big tech firms do, but like small firms don't. And
right.
So is there almost a need for that type of like very specific form of consulting that's like, hey, you hire this person to just help you with this piece? And if so, have any of you guys seen anyone do it well? Because I can't think of anyone that actually does that well.
Yeah, I would struggle for cases, but I would say yes, absolutely. There's a huge need for that, and it's obviously something I'm very interested in myself, because coming from the behavioral economics side of things and the behavioral scientist side of things, because I'm a doctor of behavioral health, What I see is that those fields are not necessarily connecting really well into the data science machine learning aspect. You know, they're in the theoretical, you know, they're not connected there. And so it's hard for them to be a bridge, but then the data scientists are in this more technical frame, you know, so they can't quite do it. So there is definitely this need for this bridge. I think the closest thing I might see at, you know, companies is like a data product manager or something like that. I think that, or product data scientist sometimes, I think is like some emerging language. But I think that there is that like emerging, it's kind of bubbling up, like something, this connection needs to happen somehow. But those are the two roles that I'm seeing it called. But yeah, I think there would be probably a pretty big need for consulting in this area. I'm not sure if companies would be aware of the need that they have for this consulting though. Like that could be a hitch.
Yeah.
I think what something like that would allow is kind of allows companies to maybe take folks that have some data, you know, acumen internally, but aren't the best at communicating, for example, and provides that bridge. I have seen that, particularly at, you know, small companies, one of the kind of success factors for this, you know, their first, you know, data scientist is how well that individual is at this kind of communication, right? And the, you know, the empathy that's referred to in the design thinking process, how well they're able to partner with the, you know, with the business and understand what the goals are. It's a little bit different than the, you know, understanding what the, you know, the action space is and this behavioral, you know, the role of behavioral science and behavioral economics and behavioral psychology and all these things. But, you know, communication, you know, data scientists have kind of a wide variety of, you know, there's a wide spectrum of communication and soft skill ability. And the folks that are most successful in, you know, the kind of the first data scientist role that I've talked to all are, you know, very strong communicators. You know, but there are a lot of folks for whom, you know, this kind of consulting capability might help fill that gap, as well as, you know, support it with some of the other perspectives like the behavioral perspectives.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, social media would be nowhere without those little red alerts with numbers in them.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I'll definitely be thinking about, you know, this question a bit more and examples and, you know, working my way through the last part of this case study so I can walk through it with you all next time. Anything else? Anything else you want me to think about some more? We'll probably start the, well, we'll figure it out next time, you know, but we'll definitely spend some time kind of reviewing this last part of this case study, as well as the material from week 2.
Sounds fantastic.
Yep, sounds good.
Awesome.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll catch you next week. And I'll, you know, I'm around in Slack if you have any questions or ideas. And looking forward to catching you next week.
Get better, Jess.
Yeah, Jess.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. See you all
Bye.
next week.
All right. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.